Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to introduce what I believe will be an eye-opening, thought-provoking presentation for all of us. I am Mariana Monteiro, Head of Workforce Diversity and Rating Technologies. In my current role and other positions, I have been privileged to see firsthand how important diversity, equity, and inclusion are to the enrichment of our organization's employees and personal lives. When we bring together people of different backgrounds and experiences, we benefit from broad perspectives, creative problem solving, and better decision making. Strong diversity, equity, and inclusion program can unleash innovation across the organization and the industry. At Rating Technologies, our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative aligns perfectly with our company's values: trust, respect, accountability, collaboration, and innovation. In a global company that has enjoyed the contributions of people from every background, ethnicity, and orientation, we are striving to create an inclusive environment where people can work, belong, and grow. We greatly appreciate the contributions of our LGBTQ+ community and Asian Pacific Islanders employees and support their interest through direct outreach, feedback, and through our employee resources group. In our company and in many others represented at this summit, there's zero tolerance for racism and anti-discrimination of any form. In our communities, however, we can continue to face challenges. We know that a growing trend of Asian anti-racial racism has been taking roots across the country and must be stopped. Transformation, change is challenging, and it takes time, but organizations like Out and Equal are doing a great job to drive change in the LGBTQ+ community and other groups through allyship. At Raytheon Technologies, we too are leveraging our size and scale and are investing to drive change in our communities. We know that when we stand together, we're strong together.
At the Executive Forum earlier this year, we heard from corporate DEI as well as movement leaders about the impact of anti-Asian hate and how we can address it through DEI efforts. In today's wide-ranging fireside chat, we'll hear more personal reflections from two leading-edge thinkers in diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as social justice. Michelle Meow is the host and producer of The Michelle Meow Show on radio and TV. She also produces programs at the iconic Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, where she is dedicated to conversations around social justice with an intersectional lens. Mijon Kim is a queer immigrant Korean-American woman writer, speaker, activist, and entrepreneur. She is CEO and co-founder of Awaken, as well as the author of The Wake Up, Closing the Gap Between Good Intentions and Real Change. Together, they discuss navigating their careers as queer Asian American Pacific Islander women, personal reflections on the current social and cultural moment for AAPI communities in the US, shared and differing individual experiences, and strategies for how to strengthen AAPI cultures of belonging and more.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Reclaiming Names, Reclaiming Space, an AAPI Fireside Chat. I'm Michelle Meow, and so excited to be speaking with my friend, activist, advocate, diversity and inclusion expert, and now also author Mijon Kim. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so there you have it. I said Michelle Kim, and then I went back and I said Mijon Kim, but this is an exciting question. Just recently, you reclaimed Mijon, and this is so important. So I think we'll start with that. What's in a name, especially, our names as AAPI people? I feel like our names tell so much to our stories.
Yes. Well, thank you for saying my full name, and I'm still getting used to existing with this full name. So I appreciate people reinforcing it and remembering, because it's important for me. And I think so many people who are thinking about their names as well. So hi, everybody. My name is Mijon Kim, and I use she, her pronouns. And I recently reclaimed my name, my Korean name, Mijon Kim, or Kim Mijon in Korean, because I wrote a book and I wanted to publish my book in my full name. And there's a whole story behind it, but it's I have the book right here, and every time I look at it, it's such a trip to see my full name written across, because I for so long existed only as Michelle Kim. And that name, Michelle, I chose when I was a younger when I was younger, and I was in the States visiting my dad, who lived here undocumented for over a decade. And I heard a grandma call out her granddaughter's name, and I saw her running towards her, and her name was Michelle. And I was like, maybe I'll adopt an American name or English name, because so many people told me, once you move to the States, you're going to want to have an American name. You're going to want to have a name that people can pronounce, people can remember, so that you don't have to face additional hardships that undoubtedly will come with me being an immigrant. So I took that advice to heart, and I didn't want to be known as anything but Michelle, because I think that for me signified being able to assimilate and be able to be accepted as, American. And so I lived most of my life as Michelle Kim. And I think parts of me were actually proud of that, proud of the fact that I was able to assimilate. I was able to lose my accent. I worked really hard to do so, and I wanted to fit in. And then I think over time, when I reflected back on my immigrant experience, and also how much of myself I lost in that process, I started to wonder what it would be like for me to reclaim my identity. And sometimes people ask me, why did you not drop your English name altogether, Michelle, and just be known as Mijon Kim? And I think about that, and I think there's nuance and complexity in existing as an Asian American, not just one or the other, but also embracing all parts of me that have really created who I am today. And I wanted to publish this book in honor of my grandpa, who's the one who gave me this name, Mijang. And there's, meaning behind it. And I wanted to make sure that I really put all of myself out there. So that's a little bit of backstory behind why I reclaimed my name at this time and what it means for me.
Thank you so much for that. And a little later, I'll tell you my name, Michelle Meow, and the meaning behind that. You recently had also commented about the importance of pronouncing our names correctly, our ethnic names. And it was during a time in which we as a country were reeling behind the traumatic murders of Korean American women at the massage parlors in Atlanta. And I it was so traumatic, and I didn't really think about how the news and the media was slashing, slandering, mispronouncing, and how that was deeply affecting me as an Asian American person. Let's talk about the importance of pronouncing names correctly, and also being able to identify AAPI folks the way that we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I would love to hear a little story about your name too, Michelle. So the backstory on the post that I did on social media you were referencing in terms of the importance of pronouncing our names correctly. I think it's such a common experience for folks who decided to keep their given name, or their, different types of names that have that ancestral legacy and the lineage and the language intact. Such a common experience for young people growing up and going to school to hear their names be butchered by their teachers in the beginning of the school year. That was an experience for me, even though I was using Michelle as my nickname. My registered name was always the Korean name, because that still is my legal name. And people butchering that, it brings me back to all those days where I was ashamed that people couldn't pronounce my name. It's a subtle cue that you don't quite belong, right? People are not, one, taking the opportunity to study your name or give effort to understand how to pronounce your name, which is your identity. So I think there's a lot of associated meaning behind the effort, and also just the value that we're putting into people's identities who are so often othered when compared to sort of the standard of whiteness. And so when the Atlanta shooting happened, and 6 out of the 8 folks who died were Asian women, and 4 of them Koreans, I first was, to your point, this was a really traumatizing event for, I think, a lot of people, because this is also coming at the time when people were beginning to see the escalation happening in terms of the anti-Asian violence that's happening all across the country because of the rhetoric that COVID-19 began because of, Asian people and Chinese people in particular. So, with the violence escalating, there was, some media coverage, but not so much. And I don't think it was really until the Atlanta shooting happened that a lot of folks started to really understand the gravity of the situation. And in the midst of all of that, we saw news coverage of the shooting happening and telling of the stories of the victims with their names butchered on a variety of news outlets. People were, especially for Korean names, because I don't think that people really understood the way that Korean people use their names. So Mijon is a full first name. That's my full first name, but sometimes there will be a space between me and Jung, which means that if we're understanding that purely from the way that we use middle names in this country, it's easy for people to think that Jung is my middle name rather than a part of my first name. So a lot of these victims' names were abbreviated, cut short, or just straight up omitted because they couldn't verify their names correctly. And I think that was yet another wound for people witnessing, wanting these lives to be honored with dignity and to have their names butchered even in their deaths. I think just was a sobering reminder that in this country, to be Asian, to be acknowledged as fully human, to be acknowledged for our lives and for our identities to remain intact, and be honored and respected by such a white-centered institution and narratives. I think that was yet another painful moment for so many people witnessing it.
And to add on to that, I mean, the erasure of our identities, which brings me to my next question about AAPI representation, where we show up, where we show up at work, where we show up in our social settings, and all of these narratives that are told for us. So I'd love for you to go into discussing, the either accidental erasure of AAPI identities, and also demystifying, some general myths out there that, AAPI people are overachievers. We have high employment rate. We have, a higher bracket in the income level here in America, and so forth and so on.
Yes. And I think we can even start with the term AAPI, which is an umbrella term that we often throw out, but I think sometimes it ends up causing harm because we actually don't end up doing justice to the diversity within that umbrella. And I think it's so often that even, for me as an East Asian woman, I see AAPI almost being thought of as synonymous with Asians and East Asians. And there is so much erasure within that umbrella category when it comes to Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, and even Southeast Asians, South Asians, and just darker skinned Asian folks in general. So I just want to name that because whenever we use that term AAPI, I think we need to be really cognizant about, are we actually talking about Asian American issues only, and not so much about the Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiian folks. So I think just the erasure even within the acknowledgement of AAPI issues, I think is something that's important for us to acknowledge, because no culture is a monolith, right? Even within Asian American umbrella, there's so many different Asian ethnicities combined into that category, which is, I think, something that I've been talking to a lot of organizations about as the beginning steps to creating a more inclusive culture for all AAPI folks, is to start by disaggregating the data that we're collecting about what types of Asian folks are there, because the demystifying some of the myths, which is so important for us to do, depending on our ethnicities, depending on how we got to this country, historically speaking, we are having very different experiences in this country, right? In terms of the fact that, even though so many people think of Asians as the model minority, which is a term that we can, begin to really interrogate and demystify as a political tool that was created to pit Asians against other ethnic minority groups in this country. And we can begin to see that even though, yes, there are some very, very well-to-do Asians in this country, there among Asians, there is the largest and fastest growing wealth gap, meaning there are very rich Asians, and also there are very, very poor low-income Asians that are just barely surviving. But those stories and those numbers are not told frequently in the media or even in casual conversations that we have that reinforce the stereotype that Asians are doing fine and they are taking away all the jobs, all the good jobs. They're the lawyers, they're the doctors, and they are getting all the leadership positions, which again is another stereotype that's been debunked in terms of Asian people being the least likely group to advance into senior leadership roles inside organizations. But again, most people do not know or are not aware of these statistics that show that even though this stereotype of Asians being the model minority exists, the reality of it is a lot more complicated and complex and diverse when we peel back the layers and really dig into the data itself.
I think now I'll share, a little bit about my name, and to add to, our identities and erasure of who we are. I want to bring up, the perpetual foreigner concept. So all my life, I've always been asked, where are you from? Like, as if I come from some other planet, not even like a potential other state or another city. But Miao is actually my middle name. When my parents immigrated here from Laos, they're actually refugees from Laos, right? I think my dad was very much set on becoming somebody else and letting go of his entire even cultural past because of the trauma associated with it. And so my given name is Michelle, and named after a Beatles song. But my mom, before having me or going into labor, she had this wild dream about this cat that followed her home. And so when I was born, and my dad was like singing the Beatles song, and she's going to be named Michelle, and my mom was meowing. So the nurse just put, Michelle Meow. But it's interesting, because when I started in radio, they went through a list of names for me and tried to Americanize, my name even more. And the response I usually get when I say Michelle Meow, people say it's cool, but what's it mean? What's it Asian for? So that's just kind of like a personal sample of always being felt like you are the perpetual foreigner. But we've seen, during COVID-19, how horrible it's been for our community and the continuance of scapegoating, even Asians during a pandemic, or when there's like some kind of crisis, and how unsafe it's been. I'd love to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yes. The perpetual foreigner concept, it's so the stereotypes that are available to us, right? We're either the well-to-do model minority, or if we don't fit into that, then we must be just a perpetual foreigner who never can ever fully fit into America and be seen as fully American. And I really appreciate you sharing your story behind your name. And also I hear both the microaggression of being asked where you're from and around your name's meaning. And I think there's also something to be said about the entitlement that people feel to knowing your deepest, sort of most sacred stories about your name and your stories and about your lives. And that's been the experience that I've had when I started using my Korean name. A lot of people unsolicited will ask me about what the name means and why I'm using both my English name and Korean name, without ever really asking for permission to engage in these conversations. So I think that's just another sort of allyship tip, if you will, to anyone who is, obviously curious and well-intentioned, to always ask before jumping into the questions and the curiosity, because so much of that curiosity, which I welcome and I appreciate, sometimes is channeled in a way that becomes yet another daily educational burden that I need to hold, than to educate people at the expense of my own labor and emotional well-being. And also the reminder that I am so often viewed as a resource to educate people, even if it's coming from a good place of wanting connection. So just want to put that out there, that not everybody will always be open to sharing about their names and the origins of their names, and the history behind it, because names can be very sacred experiences and identities to us. So I went on a little bit of a tangent there.
No, it's all right. I really just wanted to give space to all of us who identify as AAPI, as Asian, as Indigenous, to have space to talk about the importance of our identities. That includes our names, but again, it's not always this space where it's if you decide to change it for yourself, great, but I don't think it's up for discussion for somebody else to Americanize or whiteify your name for you.
Yeah.
But let's jump into diversity and inclusion, because I did mention that that's a role, very important role in your life as a diversity and inclusion facilitator. I'd like to talk about what diversity and inclusion means today, especially these last couple of years. I'm going to say a year and a half, and with COVID-19, and we're talking a whole lot about racial injustice, we're talking about social justice issues, right? And many people wanting to activate, wanting to be engaged. And so diversity and inclusion, has the role changed during COVID-19?
Yes and no. I would like to think that, well, let me backtrack and talk about diversity and inclusion in general, because I think when I was in corporate America, so a little bit about my journey in terms of how I got into this role of facilitating equity and inclusion and justice inside organizations. I immigrated to this country when I was a teenager, and I began my social justice journey when I was in high school. So I was a very sort of active organizer, youth activist, especially working at the cross section of being queer and being a person of color. So I worked a lot with LGBTQ youth and youth of color, and organizing around queer and trans youth of color in low-income communities. And I went to college thinking that I was going to get into the world of nonprofit or organizing, some type of social justice work full time. But then I realized I needed this thing called money to bring my mom over here, because she was still at the time living in South Korea, and I needed money to, one, pay for my education, survive, and help my family, and to bring my mom here. So then I decided to transition my studies and get a job in corporate America. And that was my first introduction to this field of diversity and inclusion. And the kind of cognitive dissonance that I felt as somebody who came from the world of organizing and doing social justice work, stepping into corporate America, now hearing about diversity and inclusion and joining an LGBT employee resource group, and finding out that it was such a sanitized, whitewashed version of what I thought was the work that we were going to do together inside this, organization. So I think that's a very common experience for a lot of people using the terms DEI or diversity and inclusion. Oftentimes feels like a surface level, public statement driven, sanitized version of something that, you know, should feel more similar to the work of social justice. I like to think that real work that can change and transform organizations to become more inclusive and equitable should mirror the principles of social justice. And I like to think of the work that is being done in DEI is just an extension of social justice work, rather than, you know, diversity and inclusion being something that exists in a vacuum. In order to recruit people of all backgrounds and to create an inclusive workplace, but devoid of historical context or social justice movements that's happening. So I like to think of all of these things as related, but I know that that is not the experience currently. And I think what has been achieved over the last couple of years is because of the grassroots work that's being done in the streets by the most vocal and radical organizers and activists who are pushing the envelope for us to think about these issues as all connected and urgent. More people doing DEI work, I believe, are becoming more aware that the work needs to be more rooted in social justice, rather than something that feels corporatized, something that feels you know, existing in a vacuum without the connections to what is happening in the world and in our society and what's been happening historically. And, you know, when we think about diversity, we're talking about representation, right? We're talking about having historically excluded and marginalized people who could not get into these spaces because of legal and societal barriers, and removing those barriers in order for us to be able to have more diverse representation. But even that definition, I think, is not something that we share across corporate America. I think sometimes people think of diversity as just having different types of people for the sake of having different types of people, or for the sake of, you know, innovation and more profitability, rather than thinking about the historical harm that's been caused by this country at large.
So is that an example of surface level representation? And if so, or if not, if you can go a little bit into that in depth, and how it reinforces oppression, even if that's not our intention in the workplace, but how it may reinforce oppression of, you know, AAPI employees as well.
Yes, and I talk a lot about representation in the book, because I think for so long people thought of, or people are continuing to think of representation as the end goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or even social justice. That if we have people who look like you and me in seats of power, then magically we're going to be, we're all going to be free of oppression. But I think, one, representation alone isn't going to dismantle harmful systems. People who are in those positions of power need to actually enact different changes in order to dismantle inequities. And I think if there's anything that has taught me over the years of working inside corporate America and tech organizations in particular, is that people who hold marginalized identities can still enact oppression and can still be agents of defending the status quo rather than breaking them down. And I think that, unfortunately, in order for all of us to benefit from representation, diverse representation in positions of power, we need to be more cognizant about the patterns and breaking of the patterns, even with the different faces that may not be broken. So I think representation in and of itself is a great milestone, but without being also cognizant about the patterns that we are reinforcing and repeating inside those positions of power, we're not going to see change happen without being more intentional about what that representation actually represents as an end outcome. And I think it's also important for us to think about where we are represented. And I continue to say representation in seats of power, because sometimes we think of representation as this aggregated number, where, you know, at this company, we have, you know, 50% underrepresented people of color. But then when we peel back the layers and look at the data and examine it more closely, they are concentrated in lower level positions rather than in the executive leadership positions or even at the board of directors level. So still, even though we've been putting so much effort towards representation, the outcomes have not been amazing in terms of where we are seeing progress happen.
So this might be kind of a tough question, but if we were to think of, the perfect DEI group, or, the department, or even the role, as we call it today, with some of the changes that you're talking about, what might that look like?
So perfection is never the goal. I always think that, if we shoot for perfection, we're all setting ourselves up for failure. So I'm an advocate for incrementally improving always. But I do think that so much of DEI work these days have been surface level for reasons that we've talked about already, in terms of it being devoid of historical context, having no ties to social justice, existing in a vacuum. It's often sanitized and whitewashed. And I think those are the characteristics I would like to see us challenging. And if I could have a magic wand and have people sort of think about DEI as something that is an extension of social justice work, and how using the right principles, we can create much more purposeful changes inside the company. And I think a lot of that starts with asking ourselves why this is important, why this work is important, why individually we're committing to this work, and why as an organization we're committing to this work, beyond sort of the performative statements that we see time after time. And when people get together and want to create change, sometimes I also see really well-intentioned people wanting to create a list of to-dos right away, right? Like the number one question I get as a consultant, as a facilitator from well-intentioned executives is, okay, so I understand the importance, now just tell me what to do. And while I understand where that question is coming from, because as a society, we've been trained to want to do things immediately, to be productive, to be able to say that we've done it, to be efficient in the way that we do things. But that doesn't really leave us room to create our own set of beliefs, principles, and approaches and frameworks that we can rely on, no matter what the context is. What people are wanting from me is a checklist of, here's how you change your harassment policy or anti-harassment policy. Here's how you recruit more diverse talent. Here's how you recruit underrepresented BIPOC folks into leadership positions. And boom, 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 now you're done, right? But if there was a checklist that we could hold on to and have that be the end all be all solution to ending oppression, we would have done it by now. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us, including folks in leadership positions, to really understand how we should be approaching every problem and every challenge and every context that we're in, beyond having a set of, time-bound, context-bound checklists, but really transforming the way that we are living and breathing and doing this work so that they could be a little bit more adaptive in this modern society and doing this work. And, you and I are familiar with everybody asking about the language, right? Inclusive language when it comes to LGBTQ, AAPI, right? It could go on, and language is always evolving. We know better than anyone how important language is in our community, and how also fluid and evolving it is. And so that shows another sort of beauty of how in order for us to create truly meaningful DEI initiatives and DEI efforts inside organizations, we have to be fluid and adaptive to being able to respond to the changing demands of society, changing demands of our workforce, and the people in and outside of our organizations. And I wish that DEI folks and folks who are wanting to be a part of that movement will take that lesson to heart and take their own transformation work more seriously.
You mentioned something, and I want to add this a little bit to our conversation, but being well-intentioned. I feel like a good number of us, if not a majority of us, when we go to work or we go to our organizations where, we see our peers, we are pretty much, for the most part, well-intentioned. We don't mean to say some of the things that we say or even do. And some of it is almost like, it's like unconscious. And I think that that's why we talk about unconscious bias. But I'd love to talk about well-intentioned folks or well-intentioned action items. And I'll give an example. When the shooting happened, we talked about earlier in Atlanta, I would show up to places and people would say, "Are you okay? Is there anything that I can do?" And I remember feeling super angry. Like, I think that there's a lot of things that you could do to keep people from, mass murdering or targeting women or targeting Asian people or people of color or Black and brown folks, but I don't know what to say to you, but that's what I mean. Like, when asking these questions or doing certain things that's well-intentioned, but they might do more harm than good.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, the good intentions is like such a focal point of how a lot of us live our lives, because we like to think of ourselves as good people, right? Because if we're not good, then that must mean that we're bad. And I think we get stuck in this binary of being identified as good people versus bad people. And so when our actions cause harm, it's so difficult for us to separate ourselves from the action being unhelpful from us also being labeled as bad people. And the bad people label could be exchanged with a whole slew of labels like racist or sexist or homophobic, transphobic, and people have allergic reactions to being called that, as if their entire life's work and their entire character is being burned down by this one call out that maybe your good intention didn't actually have good impacts. And I think, I want to just acknowledge that, including myself, we all want to have good intentions and have that be acknowledged, right? And I think that there is, especially after the summer of 2020, so many people with good intentions came out to wanting to do things. But similar to the example that I shared before, in terms of just asking to be educated without checking in with the other person first, especially during a time of so much trauma and so much of the work having been carried by marginalized people for so long, that sometimes we need to check our good intentions, and first think about the impacts that we're having with our intentions. And even when our good intentions are questioned, that we develop the resilience and the thick skin to be able to bear witness to the hurt that we may have caused, and also to take in the feedback in a way that doesn't cause additional harm. So there are so many things that we could do with good intentions that end up causing harm, and we'll never be able to stay clear of making mistakes. I think I still make mistakes despite my good intentions, but at that point, my intentions become almost a barrier, because then I keep thinking back to, but I meant well, but I'm a good person, but I just wanted to help, and I just wanted to be supportive. And rather than that, focusing on the impact in order to really hear the feedback and to be able to center the most marginalized people in any context. So yeah, I think good intentions are great. I think we would have a problem if people didn't have good intentions, like, no, you actually wanted to hurt me, but that would be way worse. So I'm glad we all have good intentions, but let's actually start to move the needle by focusing on the impact.
Okay, you mentioned it earlier, but money is very important. And, you started your career because you need this thing called money. But we know here in this country, at least, money is also power, but then power can also mean, folks in power. Let's turn our attention and talk about power, who actually has power. So if you're in the position of power, sometimes we confuse power with financial resources, right? Well, let me just donate money to this issue and everything will be fine or it will be better. Sometimes corporations do that. So you and I as queer people know, and we've witnessed this, the power of corporations and issues, social justice issues such as marriage equality, right? How powerful are corporations and financial resources? And then to really answer this question, I mean, who holds the power?
Mm-hmm. So there, I mean, that question is so big. And I feel like I wish that we were talking more about different types of power that we all hold, right? And money definitely carries power. It carries resources, money fuels resources, and so much of, I think, where I want to see money go towards, like so many of the areas that I would like to see more funding for, don't get funded because of a variety of reasons. So I do want to acknowledge the importance of money and money as a tool for us to be able to, reallocate and funnel resources the right places. And we all know the sad statistics around the relationship between money and politics, right? Who gets elected, what types of bills get passed, depending on how much money is behind it. And so much of the power that corporations hold can influence the types of policy changes that get made. And that what I think there's also a whole critique that we can have around the relationship between money and policies that get made, and politics in general, and lobbying and all of that. But in lieu of that conversation, in terms of how corporations can hold power to create change, I think of both the power that they have to influence change that's happening externally, whether that is in, the policies around marriage equality that so many companies, rallied around in order to show support, or even in the most recent examples of certain companies offering support to employees like Salesforce, I just heard, offer to relocate employees working in Texas in the wake of the anti-abortion bill. And I think we forget how much of our livelihoods, especially if you have a full-time job and you're employed by a company that provides you with a paycheck, that provides you with healthcare, that there is so much power that companies have in the lives of everyday people. And so there's power right there. And even as leaders inside the organization, I think they hold so much power because these organizational decisions don't happen in a vacuum, right? When people say systemic change is enacted by people holding positions of power. And so I want folks to understand that when we think about the change that we all want to see happen, sometimes those changes seem so big and so massive because they're systemic and we need to change entire systems. But also we got to remember that these systems were built by people and that they are being run by people. And so these corporations that we are sometimes up against or working inside, trying to change from the inside, from the outside, trying to influence, they're all made up of people and human beings who are enacting centuries old patterns of oppressiveness. So I think that corporations and people inside corporations hold a lot of power. And that means that there is so much opportunity for us to enact change and transformation.
Thank you so much for that. And it's a great segue, by the way, to part 3 of your book. And I wanted to talk about showing up. That's what it's titled. Part 3 is showing up. And so whether you're in a position of power, you are showing up for yourself at work as an everyday, I don't know, I call myself an average person.
You're an icon.
Thank you. You're making me blush. But you get it, right? Like for all of us, what does showing up look like?
It all depends on the context that we're in. But showing up for me in the context of this work, doing, whether it's DEI or D&I or social justice work, for me, it all comes back down to, are we centering the most marginalized people? And how are we as individuals and as organizations transforming the way that we exist every single day and making choices that are either working to dismantle or working to support oppressive systems. And I outline in the book several chapters of how I would like to see us practice different principles in order to show up in a way that is in alignment with our values of equity and justice. Things like, what does it mean for us to center the most marginalized people? Like, what does that actually look like? Let's actually break it down, whether that is in terms of how we design policies or how we are interacting with one another interpersonally, or how do we learn how to practice accountability when we mess up, because we all will inevitably. What are the steps that we can take in order to take accountability and apologize sincerely for our mistakes? To how do we talk about language? How do we think about language as they evolved? So for me, showing up is not necessarily having a set of to-do lists or a memorized list of words to say or not to say, or even a list of best practices that we can have handy to start checking off. But it's rather a set of principles that we can come back to over and over in order for us to stay in alignment with who we say we want to be and who we say, or what values we say are important to us.
Thank you so much. There's one thing I wanted to talk about, actually, and I think this is a perfect time to talk about it, but as a AAPI queer person, right? Like, I had to forge my own way. There weren't a lot of opportunities for me as a person who wanted to get into the media that doesn't necessarily look like, right, like super feminine, and also whatever I guess the appearance would be for folks who are getting jobs like on television or even on the radio, which at the time that I got into radio, 99%, if not more, were cisgender, white, older males who were on the air, especially on talk radio and conservative radio being, very popular. But I don't know. I mean, overachiever, super, have these big, high aspirational goals, or just wanted to go broke. I decided I'm going to do it, and I'm going to find a way to do it, and I'm going to do it on my own and finance myself.
Yes.
But I feel like you and I can talk a whole lot about that. And you mentioned it earlier, where you forged your own way. But I feel like a lot of AAPI folks would come forward and would talk about, even if the opportunity wasn't there, that sometimes forging our own journeys is very lonely and actually is a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, forging our own way.
Yes. And I have so much respect for you in the way that you exist and the way that you forged your own path, despite all the challenges, and the fact that like you have your own show, the way that you exist in the media when there isn't a lot of representation of people who exist outside the norm and the standards of whiteness and white supremacy. So I just want to do all the snaps and thank you for existing the way that you do. And I think it's so powerful. And I know you're inspiring so many queer AAPI folks. So thank you, Michelle. And I wish that it didn't have to be that way. I think that's really, as much as I want to talk about and celebrate the resilience of our people, and to think about and honor the survival of our ancestors. And I think a lot about my dad's struggle in this country as an undocumented person and as someone who had to learn from scratch everything, the way that he existed in the world, English, to surviving the exploitative systems that he was part of as an undocumented immigrant, as a worker who didn't have any rights. And how it's easy for me to tell that story from sort of the angle of celebrating his resilience, right? And being proud of that. And of course I am. And of course I am, thankful for all of his hard work and sacrifice. But I just envision how life would have been if he didn't have to struggle so hard, and how much of himself he would still have left without so much of that being traumatized and so much of himself being lost and erased because of his need to survive in these systems. So that's the side that I think about more often. And I think about, when I think about like you and wanting to celebrate all that you've accomplished, I also think about how much trauma you're carrying at the same time, right? In order to have gotten to where you are. And similarly for me, the way that I've had to forge my own path, some of them were, rooted in my own choices, but some of them weren't. And I think I want us to celebrate resilience, but not glorify it so much in a way that makes these systems and the oppressive patterns normalized, because we shouldn't have to be resilient all the time, right? Marginalized people, Black and brown people, queer and trans people, disabled people, Indigenous people, we should not have to be resilient all the time to survive. And I wish that we were just given the types of opportunities that were handed out to so many other people who fit into the norms of white supremacy. And that we could actually talk about our joy and our rest and our opportunities and our freedom to create whatever we want without having to compromise and without having to traumatize ourselves.
I feel very seen and heard right now. Thank you so much. As we wind down, I think I have, two very important questions for you. And thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope you're taking some great things from this. You had mentioned earlier, that you're seeing a lot of folks want to be engaged, want to participate, want to do well, do good things, for their fellow colleagues or community members. And so let's say, for example, a new committee of individuals are attempting to create an opportunity, whether that's in a corporation or organization, to address racial inequality or inequality in general. What are just some key pieces of advice you would give to this group of folks who are just starting out?
Yes. First, buy my book. Just kidding. No, but I think for folks who are starting out in a DEI committee, I think that's a really common question I get. Like, how do we get started, right? And something that I say in the book that I think is important, that I've been talking to a lot of committees about is, and I've already mentioned it, is starting with your why. And a lot of the times people want to jump into doing the work, even, and I think that's really common for people who have just woken up to realities that they have not been living in and are shocked by the fact that these injustices exist, that there are people who've been suffering and who've been marginalized for so long without their awareness. So as soon as they wake up, they just want to go and do things on behalf of people. And I think that's really where the biggest opportunities to cause unintended harm lies, because in our desire to help, we end up becoming saviors. We end up centering ourselves and our own good intentions, and without really acknowledging that there are people who've been doing this work for a very long time without acknowledgement. So first, I think being really reflective about why it is that I'm wanting to jump in and do this work. Is it because I feel like there is guilt from not having done enough in the past and I'm just waking up and I want to jump in? Is it because I want to help people who are less fortunate than me? And there's like the narrative of helping other people, us being the do-gooders, right? Or is it because I'm starting to realize that I am also impacted by the systems of inequities? And because I know that as long as there is oppression that exists for other people, I am also not going to be free. And I think there are so many different types of whys that exist, and it could be a combination of those whys that fuel somebody to take action. But I think it's important to actually have a why that is more than, because we want to create a more profitable business, right? Like the whole business case for diversity thing, I think is on the way out in terms of its usefulness, and really getting grounded in the why that is rooted in not saviorism, not the business case, but truly because people are now understanding that all of our futures are bound together. I think that would be a really powerful exercise for anyone wanting to do good out of their good intentions and wanting to not fall into the trap of performative allyship.
And I'm just going to add this just because I think that you said some great things, but with this entire year, a lot of organizations have also been created to address the anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian sentiments. And some money has been raised, and some, the attention has gotten, powerful people have gotten their attention. And if you could just add, a couple things to say what we do with all of that, right? Like how we keep our community safe and how we just don't fall trapped to reoccurring oppressive patterns that we've been experiencing since our parents, grandparents, and previous generations have come, and under traumatic circumstances, by the way.
The thing that's top of mind, because I just saw a headline about the recurring anti-Asian violence that's happening right now. And I think already we feel, and I can see the media's lack of coverage on the daily attacks that some of our community members are facing, especially elders and Asian women who are being targeted right now. And in conjunction with that, the rise in the support that people are giving towards more policing and more sort of, measures that would strengthen securities enacted by law enforcement. And I think that's a good example of how, in order for us to address one, challenges that we're facing or one group's oppression, we end up perpetuating another form of oppression that ends up harming not only, other communities like the Black community and, because that's a narrative that's been created around policing, and also the reality that the Black folks are the most harmed by the presence of police. But also we forget about people in our own communities who are the most marginalized, who are going to be impacted by that call to action, right? That within the AAPI umbrella, there are low-income migrant workers who are not going to be safe with increased police presence. There are going to be undocumented immigrants who are not going to be safe with more police presence, or queer and trans Asians or Black and brown Asians that are not going to be safe with more police presence. And so I think that's why we need to come back to the why in terms of how we want to fight for social justice, how we want to fight equity and inclusion. Because when we can start to understand that all of our struggles are interconnected, that when we advocate for the most marginalized amongst us, that's the only solution that we can have that will actually grant real equity and inclusion for all of us. Until then, I think most of our approaches and initiatives will fall short of achieving the actual outcome that we want, which is collective liberation, right? And so as we think about combating anti-Asian oppression and hate, I think there are so many things that we can learn from, the grassroots organizers who've been building coalition with other communities for so long. And also use that as an example to show that in order for us to actually fight all forms of racism that's impacting Asian folks too, we need to fight all forms of oppression that exist in society.
Last and final question, and I know you know how this feels. It seems like when I pick up the phone and I'm catching up with a colleague or someone I'm partnering up with, our responses to the question of how are you doing, how's it going, the responses seem to be very similar. Some words we're using nowadays include challenging, hard, uncertain, stressful, difficult, and sometimes even depressing, which is very personal. You don't hear that word, at least, being thrown around all the time in the workplace. But share with us, your final thoughts on how we can show up for each other, especially for traumatized communities witnessing crisis after crisis and having to return back to work or having to show up for work, even with all of this happening.
Yeah. Oh, those words. I'm familiar with those words with my personal check-ins and checking in with different communities. And I think a lot of people are feeling the whiplash of having just gone through and are still in and experiencing this global pandemic on top of everything else. So I just have a lot of empathy for people who are trying their best to do whatever it is that they have to do to survive their day to day. What we've also realized as a society is how lacking in support we all are institutionally, the types of things that we can rely on, right? The fact that we lose health insurance when we're unemployed, the fact that so many people cannot access mental health services because of the barriers that exist. And I think that when we think about both interpersonal care and institutional care, there's so much that we can do to support one another, understanding that we're all dealing with so much trauma right now. So much trauma that comes from the systemic oppression that we see, and also the grief that we're all collectively feeling. I know so many people who've lost people during the pandemic, and I know that the number is disproportionately high amongst already marginalized people. So there are some real pain and trauma that we are carrying, all of us. I'm a huge proponent of therapy, and I'm really lucky to be able to access it, but not a lot of people are able to for so many different reasons. And I think that, I know a lot of folks who are seeing this session is going to be leaders inside organizations. And the advice that I've been giving to leaders is, how could you use your power, right? If you have any type of organizational hierarchy power, that means that you also have the ability to create some breathing room for people who are on your team, whether it is by collaborating on, reprioritizing workload, or by institutionalizing certain types of care, whether that is, less time working every single day, or time off without having to explain, having mental health days, or having real access to mental health care needs and services. So I think that when people really start to take stock of their own power to create change, there are so many things that we can do inside organizations if there is that opportunity as somebody who is leading a team or with institutional power. So that's something that I want people to exercise, and for all of us to have more grace, not even for other people, but for us. I think that's so hard to do, especially for folks who are trying to survive day to day. And that self-compassion and grace have been such a lifeline for me and for so many people I know.
I'm just going to throw in my own
Yes,
recommendation or
please.
advice, but I'm getting better at saying no.
Yes.
and it's okay to say no, especially nowadays. And so thank you all so much for joining us for our fireside chat. I hope that you enjoyed it. Michelle, Mijon, I certainly enjoyed it. I feel like that was a therapy session for myself.